Okay, so what happens when a country's main military backer suddenly, well, turns off the tap? Today, we're diving into a really fascinating opinion piece from the Wall Street Journal's editorial board. It's called Europe Fills U.S. Aid Loss to Ukraine, and it was published on February 17th, 2026. It explores that exact question. Here's our game plan. First, we'll look at just how big that drop in U.S. aid really was. Then, we'll see how Europe stepped up to respond. After that, we'll get into the real-world impact this had on the battlefield and uncover a pretty critical shortage that still puts Ukraine's defense at risk. And finally, we'll break down the author's big final argument. All right, so every story has a starting point, right? For this article, it's a huge, almost unbelievable shift in American support for Ukraine. The piece immediately zeroes in on this sudden and really dramatic policy change from the one country that had been Ukraine's #1 supporter. I mean, just look at this number. The author puts it right out there. A 99% plummet in new U.S. aid allocated to Ukraine all in the year 2025. That's a staggering drop. So you might be wondering, where does a number like that even come from? Well, the article bases its analysis on data from the Kiel Institute. They're a well-respected German research group that has pretty much become the go-to source for tracking all the international support for Ukraine. But here's where it gets really interesting. The article points out a super important distinction. The flow of weapons didn't just stop cold. While direct donations from the U.S. were halted, weapons sales actually kept going. And in this kind of clever workaround, other NATO allies stepped in to buy over $4 billion worth of American weapons for Ukraine. So with this huge hole left by the drop in direct U.S. aid, the big question becomes, what did Europe do? How did they react and try to fill that gap? And according to the article, Europe's response was, wow. It was fast and it was big. We are talking about a massive jump in their own support. Military aid shot up by 67%, and financial and humanitarian aid went up by 59%. And that's compared to the wartime average before this. And this support came in all sorts of flavors. It wasn't just about sending their own existing weapons. Europe was providing huge loans, helping Ukraine build up its own defense industry. And, like we just saw, they were even buying American gear for them. Okay, so we've got all of these huge numbers and these big policy shifts. But what did all of that actually mean on the ground, on the front lines? And here's the bottom line, at least according to the editorial board, it actually worked. The surge in European support, against all odds, was enough for Ukraine to hold its defensive lines and stop a major Russian breakthrough. The author gives a very specific example to back this up, too. They point out that Russia's big push to take key cities has pretty much failed, and any small gains they've made have come at an incredibly high cost, both in soldiers and equipment. And you knew there was a but coming, right? The story takes a bit of a turn here. The author argues that while Europe's help was absolutely vital, it has its limits. It hasn't solved every single problem. And this is the real paradox at the heart of the article. Because even with Europe going all in, the simple math just didn't quite work out. The total amount of military aid from all partners in 2025 was still 4% less than what it was back in 2022. The piece argues the problem isn't just about the total dollar amounts either. It's about what kind of aid is missing. Europe could provide a ton of money and a lot of hardware, but it couldn't easily replace certain highly advanced American-made weapon systems. To really drive this point home, the author focuses on a specific threat from Russia, the constant, intense use of ballistic missiles. I mean, these are some of the fastest and hardest to stop weapons out there, and they're being used to hit important targets deep inside Ukraine. And according to the article, this is Ukraine's biggest weak spot right now. The main defense against those missiles are the American-made Patriot interceptors. And guess what? There's a critical shortage of them. So after laying out this whole complex picture, what's the final verdict from the Wall Street Journal's editorial board? What do they think is the ultimate solution here? It really all boils down to this. The author's central argument is that for the Kremlin, this war is basically a cost-benefit calculation, and it's only going to end when the price of continuing to fight becomes too high for Russia to pay. So the piece wraps everything up with a three-part conclusion. First, it gives credit where it's due. Europe has absolutely stepped up and filled a massive gap. But second, it argues that to actually end the war, those unique, critical American weapons are still needed.
And finally, the board says that military aid by itself isn't enough. It has to go hand in hand with stronger economic sanctions to really choke off Russia's war machine.
So, what we're seeing here is a really complex situation where the very foundations of support are shifting under everyone's feet. It leaves us with this huge question about the long term future of Ukraine's defense and really what it means to be an ally in modern warfare.